Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
OK, let's move on to other news this morning. Reports from Brussels suggesting that Theresa May's proposals for avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland have been completely rejected by the European Union.
Well, EU officials have told the Daily Telegraph that none of the UK's customs options after Brexit would work. Well, let's cross now to Sky's Europe correspondent Mark Stone, who is in Brussels for us. And not only have they said, Mark, that none of these things look like they're going to work, but they've apparently been forensically annihilated, the UK government's proposals.
Yes, I think we should underline the word apparently. It's interesting that having spoken to both sides over the course of the past couple of hours, they're both playing this down and effectively rubbishing the Telegraph's story. It all revolves around the Irish border question. It is the key sticking block which remains in the Brexit negotiations, a problem that they've been kicking down the road for months and months now, and at some point they're going to have to deal with it. There's not really anything massively new in the EU position, which is that of the three options that have been laid out for solving the Irish border conundrum, only one of those three is a runner, so says the European Union. Option one, which the EU has said it just doesn't think will work, is that there would be a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK so rich and so broad that there would be no need for a border anyway. Well, that, so says the EU, is just not possible. Option two is that technology on the border would mean that you'd be able to have controls without actually having a physical border. Again, the EU says it's willing to take in any detail that the Brits can put forward on that, but as things stand, they don't see how that can work, which leaves only option three, which is alignment across the Irish border, which would effectively mean that the UK would stay in the customs union. Now, today, according to the Telegraph, the EU side, over the course of the past few days of discussion, has said that option one and option two are non-starters and that option three is the only one, and therefore the UK has to stay in the customs union and has to have a border in the Irish Sea, which the UK says cannot happen. Nothing really very new in that, and in fact the British side is saying to me that the Telegraph piece doesn't reflect what they're hearing in the negotiating room. The EU side has said that talks continue. There was a suggestion that talks have broken down. I don't think they have. This is all part of the games, that the theatre of Brexit. It hasn't been very loud recently, but it's all getting going again. I think both sides, though, their positions remain the same. The problem at the Irish border remains the same too.
Let me just ask you, Mark, I mean, we're 11 months away, aren't we now, from the UK leaving the EU. Broadening out from the Irish border question, just bring us up to date on where we are with this sort of multitude of Brexit negotiations.
I was back in the UK not all that long ago. I should probably go back more often. And I was so well aware when I went back of how bored most people are with the Brexit conversation. It seems as though the majority of people, anecdotally at least, just want something to happen, people to move on from Brexit. That is happening, but it's happening very, very slowly. Phase one was the divorce. That's pretty much been done now. So they are on to phase two, which is talking about the future relationship. They've already agreed there will be a 2-year transition process where everything will effectively remain exactly as it is now through that transition process. But there is still this key date of March 2019 when everything has to be wrapped up for the transition to actually go ahead. If everything isn't wrapped up by then, that is Brexit Day, then the transition can't go ahead. And that is actually a false deadline, really, because for it to happen in March 2019, without there to be a cliff edge withdrawal, then everything has to be done and dusted. The Brexit treaty has to be signed, sealed and delivered by the autumn of this year. That is a very, very short timescale. And as I said, they are still putting off big, big problems, insurmountable problems, it may seem on the face of it, like the Irish border. They're kicking kicking that can further and further down the road. So there will be acrimonious discussions ahead, no doubt. Both sides will say this is never going to work. But hitherto, things have actually finally sort of sorted themselves out as the conversations and the negotiations have gone on. Don't get bored yet.
And so it goes on. OK, Mark, thank you.
Well, let's pick up on the progress of the Brexit negotiations. We're joined now by the Telegraph's Europe editor Peter Foster and the Conservative MEP David Campbell-Bannerman. Welcome to both of you. Peter Foster, tell us about your story today. You've reported the Ireland Brexit proposal is in tatters. Downing Street disagrees.
Well, Downing Street is rather careful with its words. Downing Street says they can find a solution if all sides work together productively, and that's a big if. What we saw this week on Wednesday was the end of 5 rounds of technical negotiations after the European Council in March. And my story is essentially that the 2 options Theresa May put forward in the Mansion House speech have been rejected by the EU. The idea that we'll collect tariffs on behalf of the EU has been ruled out, and the idea that we can somehow avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland by using technical solutions and trusted trader schemes. So in that sense, it's back to the drawing board for the Brits. Doesn't mean there aren't any solutions, but the ones that Mrs May advanced in the Mansion House speech are looking extremely shaky.
Right. Do you accept that those 2 proposals from Theresa May have pretty well been eliminated?
I think the customs partnership, the sort of the bigger picture stuff, that is in difficulty. But I mean, the game plan on the technical side, I don't agree with that at all. I've done my own paper, and Lars Carlson, the EU's own advisor, has come up with a solution already. What the EU is doing, the game plan, is to use the Northern Ireland border issue to keep us locked in the customs union, because as Katja Adler has reported, they're terrified, in her words, of us being super competitive outside of the EU.
Right, but if they've rejected those 2 proposals and the UK government has signed up to the 3rd backstop solution, which is keeping certainly Northern Ireland in a customs union, if not the whole UK, what's the alternative for Theresa May?
Well, as I say, I think my research on a technical solution, you're not talking about Canada, US, you're not talking about 370 million, it's 6.5 million. There's more people that actually cross the Turkish EU border under a customs union, same customs union, twice as many cross the border than the entire population of Northern Ireland.
So you still think the technical solution is viable?
Absolutely.
What do you say to that? I mean, where does it leave the negotiations?
It leaves Mrs May trying to square a triangle. You know, she's made 3 promises that there won't be a hard border in Northern Ireland, there won't be a border in the Irish Sea, and she will leave the customs union. The truth is that only 2 of those promises can hold true at any one time. Now, I think technical solutions could have a role to play, but what's clear from, if you read my story, from what's coming out of Brussels, is that technical solutions can have a role to play at the margin. But in order to get there, the starting point is that we join the customs union. Michel Barnier has said that himself. A very senior Irish diplomat said to me, the customs union doesn't fix everything, but without it you can't fix anything. The next step of that question is the EU are also clear that the customs union doesn't fix everything, and that you're going to need high levels of alignment. And this is why it's so toxic for Brexiteers, for David Davis, because actually to get to a world where those technical fixes work, you end up pretty close to Brexit in name only.
Will we be in the customs union in all but name?
Well, we've got to avoid that because, you know, the customs union has 20,000 tariffs, and I'm amazed, to be honest, at Labour actually supporting the customs union. You know, you're talking about hurting the poor, 60% tariffs on shoes, you know, on meats, on apparel.
But with this border issue in Ireland, will Britain have to stay in the customs union?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, as I say, their own advisor has a solution to it now.
Right, but it's being rejected by the EU. Where does it go? Where does it go from here, Polly? Do you think at this point that Theresa May, even though she has categorically said and promised that Britain will not be in the customs union, that she's really going to renege on that?
Well, it's been put perfectly. She's having to renege all the time because she made red lines that were contradictory. I mean, she, you know, exactly as you say, an impossible triangle. My hunch is that we will end up in something so like the customs union. It may not quite be called the customs union, because in the end, that's what suits us. The fantasy of all this trade elsewhere compared with the tariffs and the barriers that will be put up against us if we don't are just so daunting as one industry after another discovers what's about to hit them, including even, ironically, the fishing industry, who wouldn't be able to sell their fish if there was no deal and there was no proper customs union.
Do you agree that that is now a more likely scenario for the government to agree to?
Not at all.
Why?
Because, look, even the EU now, their official position is basically CETA++, if you put it that way. They've given ground on services, they'll offer us services, we'll have 100% tariff-free, 100% quota-free deal. That's where we're at. They've agreed that. Because we import so much more, we will be their largest customer outside of the EU.
All right, well, let's, though, get back to the negotiations. Michel Barnier, according to you, has announced that the talks are going to pause until the Northern Ireland issue is resolved. Is that right?
Not precisely, actually. What I say in my report is that Michel Barnier has ended the internal scoping process of the EU. So the discussion in the EU about what the future looks like has essentially reached a pause because there isn't much else to talk about. Until the Brits come forward with a workable solution, you can't really get into a serious discussion about what the future is going to look like. So what that speaks to, the fact is that if we don't get a deal on Ireland by June, you're going to be looking at an increasingly flimsy document, non-binding trade document, to go with the withdrawal agreement in October.
Right. Do you agree time's running out?
Well, the pressure is on, but no, the point is we don't have any tariffs. You don't have any, the point about negotiations is it's all about getting rid of tariffs. We don't have any tariffs to get rid of. We don't have any quotas to get rid of.
What makes you think the EU is going to do an about turn on this issue on Northern Ireland?
It's putting pressure on because its preferred policy is to force us staying in the customs union, but that is absolutely ridiculous. Not our policy. The policy hasn't changed.
But it's not just pressure from the EU, is it? It's pressure here too. I mean, the House of Lords, as you know, defeated the government as part of the EU withdrawal bill. How much do you blame your Tory colleagues in the Lords?
Well, I think their vote was absolutely shameful. I mean, here you have a very privileged group of people forcing the poor to be hurt more by their 20,000
Oh, that's absolute nonsense. The idea is the Conservative Party and the Brexiteers are standing here for the poor. I think probably...
No, sorry, the customs union.
Well, let's not have a battle about who's spoken more to the poor, but carry on. Carry on what you were saying, Polly.
I mean, this is realms of unreality. We're going to get everything we want and we don't have to give anything away instead. What alarms me most of all about the Irish border, though, is that I hear a number of Conservatives, including Boris Johnson, suddenly saying, well, you know, the Good Friday Agreement, it's time we renegotiated, rethought it. And you think, right, are they really willing to make that sacrifice? Over 3,000 people killed, and they're willing to go back to those days. I think any undermining of the Good Friday Agreement, particularly as things are very tense in Northern Ireland now anyway, with no government in power, is very alarming.
How dangerous is this moment, Camilla, for Theresa May?
The only people who would be undermining the Good Friday Agreement would be the EU if they force a hard border on Northern Ireland. The EU has said it doesn't want it, Britain has said it doesn't want it, and Ireland has said it doesn't want it. And actually, this is a negotiation, so the government does have another strategy. I'm not advocating it, but the Brexiteers will say no deal. Right. That leaves two problems. First of all, it leaves a massive problem for Ireland, because if Ireland has the common external tariff slapped on it, it will have tariffs on its beef and it will go bankrupt. Second of all, if we withdraw the £40 billion pot of cash, the EU goes bankrupt. It'll have to turn around to all of the countries and say, could you give us a bit more, please, because we've just lost Britain's £40 billion.
But
that's a fairly good negotiation stance, one imagines.
Where we are now, though, Camilla, how much pressure is Theresa May under politically here? We've had the House of Lords defeat. We've had this motion that has been tabled by Tory rebels calling on the government to make being in an EU customs union a negotiating objective. How seriously should ministers take this?
Of course she's under political pressure, but she needs to also think about the public. The public voted for Brexit. The public doesn't advocate a peers against the people scenario, and the public doesn't also like this rhetoric about reversing Brexit. Brexit's happened. We mustn't lose sight of what the public wants in all this.
Nobody knows what the public voted for. They voted
to be out. The public knows exactly what they voted for, Polly, for goodness sake.
You don't speak for them any more than I do. We know they voted for us.
Nobody has changed their view. Any polling has suggested that the Brexit and Remain vote remains the same. So you haven't had a load of Brexiteers pulling their hair out going, I didn't vote for this, I didn't vote for this.
I agree.
So they did know what they were voting for.
Nobody knows what they they think about the customs union. Nobody knows.
They haven't changed their mind.
Don't talk over each other. Go on, Polly, just end that point and then must come back to Peter.
I'd just say that, we know that we voted for out. I totally agree. People haven't changed their mind much about that.
They haven't.
But what out means is what all of this is about.
I think it's clear what out means now.
An out that really does us harm, or an out that minimal damage.
The frustrations that are being voiced over there, the problem is that the accident of history creates an external EU border in Ireland. Theresa May doesn't want to put a border in the Irish Sea, and she has a treaty obligation in the Good Friday Agreement not to undo the borderless arrangements of the Good Friday Agreement. So she cannot deliver on that for the frustrations, people who want to be out. She can't physically do that. And so, to David's point, if the Ireland thing didn't exist, we could be sitting here having a conversation about tariffs, about trade-offs, or whether we want to do rules of origin.
But
about that.
This is where the
conversation, because she doesn't want to break up the United Kingdom and she doesn't want to ruin the Good Friday Agreement.
So what's the solution in your mind for her?
She's in rocks and hard places. She has to join a customs union, because if you want an all-UK solution, right?
Because she doesn't want to break up the...
sake of argument, she joins the customs union, and then the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland say, OK, we'll be aligned on goods and agriculture. It doesn't solve the problem, because the chlorinated chicken, etc., that we might have done a deal with the Americans, it's still going to have to be policed in the Irish Sea border, and she can't sign up to that.
I was just going to say, as we sit here, we've got the Commonwealth down the road. They're talking about £700 billion of deals. We can't do our own trade deals. We stay in the customs union. I'm on the trade committee of the EU. They're not doing a great job. They haven't got one with China, with India, United States.
Thank you both for coming in.
Now, Number 10 has denied reports in the Daily Telegraph suggesting that Theresa May's proposals for avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland have been completely rejected by the European Union.
A spokesperson for the Prime Minister says that the existing two proposals remain the basis for negotiations.
Labour MP Chuka Umunna leads a grassroots coordinating group opposed to a hard Brexit, and he joins us from South London. A very warm welcome to you, Mr Umunna. Your comments on these reports in the Telegraph that the proposals put forward by the UK government on the border issue have reportedly been forensically annihilated?
That is in line with other reports. The Telegraph are not the only news outlet reporting that. And what it shows is very much that the European Commission is to some extent aligned with the House of Commons Northern Ireland Select Committee. The Northern Ireland Select Committee published a report over the last couple of months where it said it couldn't find any example globally of a technical or technological solution to the challenge of avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland in the event that Brexit happens. That's notable because that Northern Ireland Select Committee not only has 3 DUP members on it, but also Kate Hoey, my neighbour here in Lambeth, who is a big proponent, of course, of Brexit. And so the EU Commission is to some extent aligned with the House of Commons. And the final thing I would say on this is that the ultimate way of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland is for us, at the very least, to stay in the customs union, to be full participants in it, but also ideally the single market too. And it's quite clear at the moment that there is not a majority in the House of Commons for the Prime Minister to be adopting the negotiating position that she has, which is to take the UK out of the customs union.
Now, your views on the matter are quite well known. Just in response to this Telegraph story, there have been some comments on Twitter. Lord Lawson has said this is not a border issue, it is irresponsible scaremongering. The government has also said the Telegraph piece does not reflect what's happening in the meeting room. These are gains. Is this just all posturing and a deal will get done further down the road?
Well, in some senses, you would say Lord Lawson would say that, wouldn't he? Because he wants to press on with Brexit, regardless at all costs, and keeps ignoring the new facts which are emerging. And the new big fact that has emerged over the last few months is really the only way of avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic, is for us to stay in the customs union and the single market. And of course, Lord Lawson wants to take us out of both of those things. But make no mistake, there has been some talk, and of course this is all a matter of arithmetic in the House of Commons. There was some talk that, you know, in the wake of the Syrian intervention, what's happened with Salisbury and Russia, there has been some suggestion in the media that there is a weakening of resolve amongst Conservative MPs who think we should stay in the customs union. There's been some suggestion that all of these recent events have made it less likely that in the end they will stick to their guns and their principles and put their country before their party. What we have seen over the last 24 hours is a cross-party motion to keep us in the customs union being put down by 10 senior members of the House of Commons, mainly select committee chairs, importantly including the former ministers Nicky Morgan and Bob Neill, but also the well-respected chair of the Commons Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston. That is due to be debated on Thursday. And what is their motion saying? We've got to stay in the in the customs union. What this is a warm-up. That is a debate on a motion, but this is a warm-up to votes on binding legal bills, the customs and trade bills, but also the EU withdrawal bill, which will come back to the House of Commons over the next few weeks on the same issue.
Yeah, that's what I was going to come on to ask you. So the debate on Thursday, and we have if it's non-binding vote, what does it matter, even if it ends up the way that you predict?
Well, the reason that these select committee chairs have instigated this debate is because there is a strong feeling that we haven't properly debated the implications of the UK leaving the customs union. And there's also a sense that you've got a government pressing on and continuing with a negotiating position on the customs union that does not enjoy a majority in the House of Commons. Of course, that's because Theresa May lost her majority last year. So in frustration at the fact that we haven't properly debated this, we will be debating the general issue of the customs union on Thursday. But what will really matter is when we actually have the debate on legislation. A debate on emotions like a general debate that you have in the House of Commons on a particular issue, but it's not legally binding. But when the EU withdrawal bill comes back to us from the House of Lords, fresh with a customs union amendment, the government was defeated on that in the House of Lords this week. They tried to stop the customs union featuring in the EU withdrawal bill. It will now do so when it comes back to the House of Commons. So we will have votes on the customs union on the EU withdrawal bill. And there are also the customs and the trade bills, two other pieces of legislation which will shape UK trade policy in the medium term. They are due to come back to the House of Commons as well. And myself and Anna Soubry, the co-chairs of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on EU Relations, along with a number of other people across the parties, cross parties, we've got amendments down on both of those bills to ensure that we stay fully participating in the customs union too. So that's coming down the lane too.
Let me just ask you, what do you say to people who just say, come on, you know, you're just a Ramona, you're ignoring the reality that we are leaving the EU in under a year. It's time to move on. Let's just make the best of the situation that we have.
Well, I think we should, of course, move on. And the people wanted us to instigate the process of us leaving the European Union in 2016, and that's what we all did. The House of Commons voted for the Prime Minister to invoke Article 50. That is done. That is in the past. We are now dealing with the actual detail of the Brexit deal. We haven't had a say, the people haven't said a say on the form of Brexit, which is why I'd like, actually, the British people to determine whether we accept the Brexit deal or not. But don't forget this, leaving the customs union and leaving the single market was front and centre of the Conservative Party's general election campaign in 2017. And far from winning support for that proposition, they lost support and they lost their majority, which is now why the Prime Minister relies on the DUP to be able to govern. And of course, there is a country that is, participates in some way in the customs union, Turkey, which isn't part of the European Union. So we don't have to buy the form of Brexit that extremists like, Brextremists as they've come to be called, like Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson, espouse. We actually have a choice in this, and we don't have to have some elite like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg telling us how to do this. Let the people and Parliament decide. That's all we're arguing for.
OK, Chakra Muna, thank you very much indeed, joining us on Sky News.
Now, Downing Street has denied reports in the Daily Telegraph suggesting that Theresa May's proposals for avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland have been completely rejected by the European Union. Well,
a spokesperson for the Prime Minister said that the existing two proposals remain the basis for negotiations. Well, let's take a look at those options.
The UK has committed to protecting North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland and guaranteed no hard border.
Well, both sides would prefer to keep an open border, but this economic solution is proving difficult because of the UK's desire to leave the customs union and single market.
The second option is a special arrangement for Northern Ireland using border technology. But this solution's been described by Britain's former ambassador to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, as a bit of a fantasy island unicorn model.
Well, the two sides have agreed that, if all else fails, there'll be a backstop option, meaning Northern Ireland would effectively remain within the EU customs union, thus creating a border in the Irish Sea. But despite agreeing to this, in principle, the UK has rejected the EU's interpretation of what it means, with Mrs May saying no United Kingdom Prime Minister could ever agree to it.
If the UK position is rejected by Brussels, the government could be faced with a choice between remaining in the customs union or accepting a hard border in Ireland. Joined by the Telegraph's Europe editor, Peter Foster. Peter, thank you for your time. You've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on in these meetings. So out of those three options we've just highlighted, what is now the most likely?
Well, this is the difficulty for Mrs May, isn't it? She's made three promises on Ireland and Brexit, which are mutually incompatible. She said she won't upset the Good Friday Agreement and she won't create a hard border in Northern Ireland. She said she won't upset the territorial integrity of the UK by having a border in the Irish Sea. But she's also said we're leaving the customs union and the single market. And that is a triangle which she can't square, for a slight mix of metaphor. But, you know, only two of those promises can be true at any one moment. And the problem she's got is, you know, when confronted with that in the Mansion House speech, she said there are now two options for this. One is a situation where we collect tariffs for the EU, a special customs partnership. That's been ruled out of court, as I report this morning. And the second one is a streamlined custom arrangement using trusted trader schemes. And again, at the meeting between Ollie Robbins and Sabine Wayand, the two chief officials, it was made very clear to Mr Robbins that those options wouldn't fly. So the Brits are back to the drawing board to a large degree, and they've got to come up with a solution. And I think you're going to see the pressure build between now and the June European Council.
I suppose passionate Brexiteers would say that this doesn't necessarily need to be the UK's problem, even though I know the Prime Minister was conciliatory in a speech recently saying that it is our responsibility. But some people would say, indeed Douglas Carswell said, that they're not sure the EU gets the whole leaving the EU thing. We are not supplicants. It's not for them to reject how we arrange things, meaning, I suppose, that we can leave, hard Brexit, and the border problem is up to the EU.
But it's not. I mean, as Theresa May says, I mean, that's just simply not true. If Brexit was happening and by the accident of history, it didn't throw down an external EU border in Ireland, all of that would be true. But because the border question arises as a result of Brexit, it's not true. I mean, as Theresa May has said herself in her Mansion House speech, we can't just say to the EU, well, if you want to put tariffs on the border, you be our guest, and we won't do it. We have our own WTO legal obligations to manage our customs border. If we did that, we'd have to have no custom checks on any of our border in order to be consistent. That clearly isn't a cogent position, and this is the problem with Ireland. Nobody wants the Irish question, as it were, to be the tail that wags the dog, but the Irish border question is a legal geographical fact, and it can't be magicked away. And I think that's what you're seeing now in Brussels. They gave us 5 rounds of technical talks to see whether we could come up with some solutions, and they've basically said these don't fly. Go away and think of some new ones. And you know, a lot of that comes down to, are you prepared to join a customs union with the EU? And that raises a whole series of questions about how we have an all-UK solution that avoids a hard border in Northern Ireland, which would require us to be aligned in terms of goods and agriculture with EU regulations to an extent where the Brexiteers are not wrong. You do end up with a Brexit that doesn't look much like Brexit.
Peter, I just want to ask quickly before we go, you know, your sources are telling you this is what happened in this meeting. Ollie Robbins, Sabine Wayand that you describe, who has the power at the moment in these meetings?
Sabine Wayand has the power in these meetings. You know, the clock is ticking, as Michel Barnier never tires of saying. The difficulty for the Brits is, the other option is we just walk away. But nobody believes that's what we're going to do. I think, you know, one of the sort of watersheds for the EU side is that once we got through the March European Council, it's very clear to them we ain't going to walk away. It would cause chaos. And a few people would cheer and say, good old Theresa for standing up to the Europeans. But after you've had a few weeks of queues at the border with Dover and complete chaos, in Sterling going through the floor, it's not going to fly. Nobody seriously thinks we're going to walk away. At that point, they hold the whip hand.
OK, Peter Foster, thanks for speaking to us.
The debate over Brexit. Number 10 has denied reports in the Daily Telegraph suggesting that Theresa May's proposals for avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland have been completely rejected by the European Union. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister said that the existing two proposals remain the basis for negotiations. Well, joining me now from our Westminster studio is Ruth Dudley-Edwards, columnist at the Belfast Telegraph, and in Dublin is Colette Brown, columnist at the Irish Independent. Hello to you both. Ruth Dudley-Edwards, what does this mean now?
Hello, Sarah. Not to read too much into it, it's a standard EU ploy, leaking at a particular time. I was much affected by reading Yanis, oh heavens, I've just forgotten his surname, the Greek ex-finance minister who wrote a wonderful book called Adults in the Room, in which he recorded all the negotiations, recorded and gave us verbatim all the negotiations with EU officials, and the duplicitousness and the lies and the twists and the leaks of mythical leaks. All of that went on is exactly what's been happening in all the negotiations with Britain. Lying about the British not having done any homework, lying about them not turning up to meetings, and leaking documents that barely exist at a moment that is most propitious for them. It's a very dishonest method of proceeding, and all it does is frighten people.
Colette Brown, your reaction to that? Ruth Dudley was saying that this is just the EU. We shouldn't worry too much about what they're saying.
Well, there's absolutely no evidence for that, and what I can actually say is that there's no surprise in Dublin at all at this leak. The Irish government ministers aren't commenting formally on those leaks, but what the feeling privately is that there's no surprise. This was expected. The British government's bluff is being called in respect of the Irish border. The British took the vote. They voted for Brexit without any thought for what would happen to Northern Ireland. There's barely been any thought given to the arrangements that are going to be put in place to have this frictionless border. The best that the Brexit Minister, David Davis, can say about all of this is that there's going to be some newfangled technological solution. If Mr Davis can explain why these sorts of technological solutions aren't in place in other jurisdictions in any country on the planet, then, you know, that would be pretty good from him.
There was a very interesting paper put out months ago, which was commissioned by the European Parliament and was produced by somebody who had been the World Trade Organization, or the World Customs Organization's main director, just outlining how it could be achieved, looking at the entire world and how it could be done. And what happened in Brussels was just throwing it out. They've thrown out, just as ludicrous and pathetic and unicorn, any suggestion made by the British authorities. And it's done because they don't want it to work. The British do not want a hard border. Nobody sane wants a hard border. And one of the regrettable things in Dublin, and I have the greatest sympathy for the Irish government and all this, of course I do, and I understand why the Irish are so upset about this. But the point is that the last Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, had a study group going on methods of making the border soft in the event of the referendum happening, going the way it was. And it was abolished when the new Taoiseach came in. That was very foolish. It's very foolish that the Irish government put all their eggs into Brussels' basket, because they will be betrayed as Greece was betrayed.
Colette Brown, does it matter what Theresa May had put forward in terms of proposals? I mean, and you said there wasn't enough detail, but would it have mattered? Would the EU not have just rejected it outright, as we heard there from Ruth Dudley-Edwards?
No, of course it matters. And I mean, there has been, I mean, the Irish government have said that they're eager for the UK government to put proposals to them, but those proposals have to be credible. They must be serious proposals. I mean, we can't keep listening to months and months and months of technological solutions without the UK government telling us what those technological solutions are. Brexiteers in the UK sometimes reference the border between Norway and Sweden as a way to move forward. But the border between Norway and Sweden is not a frictionless border. It is not an open border. There are often queues for many hours at peak hours at that border. So if you want to leave the single market and if you want to leave the customs union, that's fine. That's okay. But you can't do that and then maintain the fiction that you want a frictionless open border in the north, because there is no credible legal way for that to happen. So I think it's a binary decision that the UK government have to make, or else it's going to be an option that's going to be completely unpalatable for many people in the UK and completely unpalatable for Theresa May, because she's already said that it would be, and that would be to locate the border down the Irish Sea.
Ruth Dudley Edwards, so it's stay in a customs union or a hard border with Northern Ireland, which the Prime Minister has said no British Prime Minister could ever agree.
I'm an optimist by instinct, and I think the EU will come to its senses, but in the meantime it will be trying as far as possible, for reasons one can understand, to punish the British and make sure that nobody ever follows in their footsteps. And I think it is foolish, it frightens a lot of people, it's storing up bad relations, but in the end there is a perfectly straightforward solution to the problem of having a frictionless border in Northern Ireland. And it is time that the Irish and the United Kingdom got together to find the best way of doing it and presenting the EU Commission with that.
Colette Brown?
Well, I mean, Ruth may say that there's an easy solution to this, and if heads were just knocked together, then sense would prevail. But unfortunately, we're talking about international trade agreements, we're talking about tariffs that are placed on goods that are not coming from the EU, that are not coming from the UK, but come from other countries and are subsequently moved through the UK. This is why it is so difficult. There isn't an easy solution here. And Ruth is doing this Brexiteer line where it's scaremongering about the EU, and it's the EU as the bogeyman who's inflicting all this pain and hardship on the UK government. That is not the truth. Anybody who has any reading of what's going on knows it's not the truth. The UK voted for Brexit and they thought that it would be easy. They thought that accommodations would become quite easy. They're finding that it's a bit harder than that. Now, the Irish government are desperate for a solution to this. We just recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Nobody wants troubles to return to the north. Everybody wants business and trade to be able to operate as effectively as it is now. But it's going to take a lot of hard thinking and some soul searching from within Westminster, and some credible solutions, please, from David Davis and the rest of his government for that to happen.
OK, Ruth Dudley Edwards, Colette Brown, that's all we've got time for. Thank you both very much indeed.